Welcome to Salon Talks. I am Mary Elizabeth Williams, and we are in for a very sweet treat today. You know, in the Broadway musical Waitress, there's a recurring refrain that I love: sugar, butter, flour. But in a world where all three are becoming increasingly vilified, is there still room for pie? Nicole Rucker is bringing the sweetness back. She is the chef and the owner of the Los Angeles restaurant Fiona, and the brains behind what has been called the best key lime pie recipe. I want to know what the secret is. She's got a debut cookbook out now called Dappled, baking recipes for fruit lovers, and she's here to take us through the dog days and beyond. Hi, welcome.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
All right, so I want to start, before we talk about the book, as I mentioned, it feels like we're in this moment where sugar's always in and out of fashion, right? But it's always like, I quit sugar, how to quit sugar. Of course, anything to do with gluten is monstrous, and then you've got your basic, your fats, your butter, and yet
been pretty strong, and we didn't really see a slowdown this year as we did in previous years, like for the January 1st thing, where people stopped eating all of those things. People didn't do that as much, so I think that people are making room for it. I think most importantly, people are looking for high quality versions of those things now, and so as those become more available and people have an option to eat something that's sweet and they trust it and it's well made and it's not as processed, they can make room in their lives for it. And that's what my customers say to me. So they'd rather get something that's wholesome and delicious than a trashy, whatever it is with high processed flour and, bad fats in it. But butter is back for sure.
Well, I'm so glad. Well, it never went away in my life. I can promise you that. But it feels like, we've swung in this direction where, I was just in Southern California recently, and I never heard more people talking about keto in a 4-day span than I have in my life. So it's not gone away entirely, but that sense of you can eat this sort of prepackaged diet food, which is really not good for you and not good for your health, or you can have that cookie at the end of the meal or that little scone at the beginning of the day, and it's not the end of the world.
I think if you have a good bakery and a chef or owners that are reputable for making high quality stuff, people find it no matter what, even if they're on their keto. A lot of people do 1-day cheat day when they're on stuff like that, and when they cheat with something that's really good. So I have friends who do paleo and keto throughout the week, or vegan in the day, and then at night they'll have something that's not
Mark
vegan.
Bittman.
Yeah,
I do that.
Yeah, my husband, he's pretty health conscious, and he does like to have 2 cheat days a week, basically. But the rest of the time, he pays attention to what he eats.
Well, it kind of keeps everything in balance then.
Yeah, and you appreciate the good stuff more, I think.
And this book is full of the good stuff.
Yeah.
This is it's also so beautifully photographed.
Thank you.
Really is just a very warm, homey, inviting, you get the feel of what it would be like to be in a kitchen, having these wonderful scents and flavors presented to you through this book. So well done.
Thank you.
So let's talk about you a little bit. You did not start out in this world of baking, and you have this origin story of spending your last $2, you talk about it in the book, on a peach.
Yeah, when I was in college.
That was a transformative moment for you, and that really speaks to the power of baking and of the fruits that you love.
Yeah, that was a good memory. But I always loved baking and food, and I had an interest in it. But when I was a child and when I was in high school, going to culinary school wasn't really an option, especially for women. It wasn't really a thing yet. So I kind of was just before that age group where people were being kind of funneled into more creative professions like cooking and culinary school. So I chose the other thing that was available, which was art school. And it got me pretty far. So I'm happy I made that decision.
And you bring that artist sensibility now to the world of food.
I try.
And to your restaurant and to this beautiful book. So, you talk about, we've been having this conversation about, but if you have a bakery that you really trust in your neighborhood, or you have somewhere to go where you know that the baked goods are going to be really good and they're going to be high quality. But this is a book for those of us who also want to maybe bring some of that into our own kitchens and our own homes, and even I'm going to tell you, I'm a good cook, and I'm even kind of a good baker, but then we get to that level of baking where it's just like it becomes very intimidating very fast. And even people who feel comfortable in the kitchen, the idea of baking, and especially the idea of like working with fruit, feels very fussy and intimidating and hard. So what would you, what's a good conduit if you want to get into this book and you want to be someone who's like, yeah, you know what, I really would love to have like pies and buckles and you know, scones in my life. What would you say, all right, here's the page you should open to start you on your journey?
Well, I think you should start with appreciating fruit and learning what's ripe and eating it and trying it first. And so you can start with the introduction where we talk about what ripe fruit is and how it happens. And I think that there's the mystery around baking and cooking with fruit is sometimes based in it's not ready yet, you know, and so you get a lackluster result, or it's too ripe and then you get a crappy result. So start there. But then I think from there's a lot of really simple recipes in the book that are easy impact on your wallet, because a lot of fruit recipes can be very expensive, especially nowadays. Good fruit is very expensive.
And
sometimes.
You're very transparent about that, which I like. You're like,
Costs a lot of
okay,
money.
like if you want to make this particular pie with a whole bunch of berries in it, this one's going to set you back.
It will.
And you are also very transparent. I think there's a saying about like the moment that a pear is good is about like 5 minutes. Like you've got about 5 good minutes with a pear on either end of it.
Yeah.
And that's a really difficult sweet spot for the uninitiated. And you go through that and you talk about, okay, here are the things that are going to continue to ripen when you get home, and here are the things you have to get at their peak, and here's what happens when you bake with frozen fruit as opposed to fresh fruit. And all of that is like a consideration that you have to train yourself before you even turn the oven on.
Yeah, and I think we have to reconnect with a joy and a love for these products before we start messing them or, you know, getting into cooking with them. But that being said, there are a lot of really easy recipes that are super easy to access for even someone who's never baked anything before. Like my husband, who has never really even made cookies, and he can make pasta and he can grill and things like that, but he's never made a dessert ever. And he made the lime pie from the book, which is very easy and very cheap to make. And he made it perfectly, and I did not help. Just very easy.
And this is your iconic pie that you say kind of saved you.
Yeah, for the time being, it definitely saved us. Yeah.
And can you tell a little bit of that story, because it's a really sweet.
So when we were starting out, we had just opened the restaurant, and we kind of like passed through the initial wave of press, and the holidays hit us pretty hard, and we weren't thinking about making the lime pie. Specifically, we do say lime pie. We don't say key lime pie because they're not key limes. But we weren't going to make that because we were going to move on to fancier stuff. And then we needed to put it into the rotation because it's a very easy pie to make and it stays really well. And we started making it during Thanksgiving, and it was a hard sell for people because it wasn't pumpkin. And after the holidays, business kind of trickles, usually around January. It got slower and slower, and then Bill Addison found us and started coming to the restaurant, and he had just taken the position of one of the food reviewers for LA Times. And he happens to have a love of pie and a love for sweets. In particular, he loves key lime pie because he grew up with that in his household, and he fell in love with the pie. He wrote the first review for the year and his first review in his position of Fiona, and then we just got packed with people looking for that pie and coming to us for that, and it was, you know, both good and bad because it got crazy, but people found us through that, and it's wonderful.
And that's the real labor of love. That feels like, that recipe feels almost like the heart of the book. I mean, you've got a lot of other great stuff. Okay, so as someone who, there's every single element of a lime pie scares me off. And I'm going to start with the fact that I don't like rolling pastry dough.
Lime pie doesn't have pastry dough.
Okay, so this one has a crumb. That's right.
crumble.
It's got a
It's
crumb.
graham cracker.
That's okay. But then a custard. I don't like making custard.
It's not really a custard. You just like dump a can and pour some lemon juice in it and some eggs.
I'm already intimidated, right? And
Yeah.
like all of that is really kind of feels.
It's basically like making a smoothie. If you can make a smoothie, then it's like that. You don't have to cook any custard. You don't have to, you know, temper any eggs and whisk them slowly. You literally dump everything in this bowl and you put it inside this par-baked cookie crumble crust with stuff from the grocery store and bake it. And there's a couple twists in the recipe that make it a little bit more special than the traditional recipe. Most of it is more salt in the crust.
Kind of the secret, right? Like with the
that's
sweet.
the modern twist. And then the topping is really the part that gets people, because they're expecting the topping to be like really sweet whipped cream, and it's sour cream with heavy cream and there's no sugar in it. So it really transforms the whole pie into something slightly, I don't want to say elevated, because regular key lime pie is also very good, but it just changes it into something that's a little bit easier to eat more of, which is good or bad, depending on who you talk to.
Well, I think that's what I really like about looking through the recipes, is you have a real sensibility of like the way that you work with fruit is going to be different from the way that you work with chocolate or the way that you work with caramel.
Definitely.
And you really explore the tangy side of it. And you're very forward on ricotta and yogurt and sour cream and all the things that make fruit shine.
Yes.
In a different, more astringent way. And you use tomatoes in their fruit form, which I've not tried those, but I have to say that also scares me off.
Oh, interesting.
I get a little scared off at the thought of having tomatoes for dessert.
Well, if you're a Southerner, then you would be like, oh, I recognize that dish, because in the South, in South Carolina, in Georgia, there is tomato pudding that gets put on the table. And it's put on the table next to savory stuff, which is really interesting. But when I tried it for the first time, it is very sweet. And so it's sort of like at Thanksgiving when you have sweet potato casserole with marshmallows on it at the same table as gravy and turkey. That is dessert. I mean, marshmallows are dessert, but it's allowed on our plate because I don't know why, So,
well, I mean, pumpkin is a vegetable, and carrots are vegetables, and we're all
carrots are a vegetable, but pumpkin is not a vegetable.
It's a gourd.
Yeah.
But you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It's not blueberries, and yet we eat those things that we would eat as a side dish for dessert all the time, and that's totally fine. You have a really gorgeous looking carrot cake recipe in there.
It's an apple cake, and then there's a carrot and ginger cake. Yeah, they're both really good. I snuck it in there with pineapple so that it could be a fruit recipe. And there is a pumpkin recipe in there that's made with kabocha squash, technically. But, there are those dishes that have place in the history of like using what we have. And tomatoes, everyone talks about how sweet and delicious they are. And there's not that much difference between like stewed tomatoes with biscuits on it and then like something more appropriate for people to consider dessert, like a table fruit, like a peach or something like that. But I have had people who are really into tomatoes who have tried the recipe and they're super into it. So I guess it has to be like how you frame it. You could also definitely serve that dish as like part of a meal with a salad, and it would be totally approachable and like seamless. It's very savory but also sweet, and biscuits on top, and biscuits are good. So
biscuits are really good, and I do love a savory and sweet. I'm going to tell you what my favorite dessert in the world is apple pie with cheddar cheese on top.
Oh yeah, so
that's like the most delicious thing.
You're
in the
like
world.
2 steps away from tomato pudding.
Right. Okay. Then I'm on
it's very close.
So it's a slippery slope. You're saying, right? Because if
yeah.
I like that, then I also probably like grilled cheese and tomato, and I sure did.
Grilled cheese and tomato is great, and you could put cheese on top of it.
Right. Well, that's the other thing.
It'd be very good.
Is like anything that you put melted cheese on is probably going to be extraordinarily delicious.
Yeah. It has ricotta in it already, so it's fluffy and it has like a dairy slant in there. But it definitely could have some salty cheese on top of it.
Everything should have salty cheese on it. That's like rule number 1 of life, I think. Just like shave some cheddar on anything.
That's my favorite cheese is cheddar.
Right,
so.
it's like because it's the saltiness again, and it's just and the meltiness of it is so good. So if I want to be like an entry level like you, what would be something that would like kind of show off, like would make me feel like make people think that like, oh yeah, you're kind of a show off, like you really like dazzled me with something, like I want to entertain some guests.
Yeah, I think that really the message of the book is that you should impress people by carefully choosing some fruit and wowing them with how like perfect and ripe it is, and doing as little as possible to it. So if you really want to impress people, sometimes I find making a really good crisp or making a cobbler is a perfect way, because people are expecting something maybe a little fancier when you invite them over, and then you put this like rustic thing on the table. But the difference between a good crisp and a bad crisp is like the guts. And if the guts are made with really good fruit and you've seasoned it well and you add a little salt to it, it's really impressive.
Well, you won me over in the book when you said that you will take like something that tastes good over something that looks good any day, because nothing makes me angry like a beautiful dessert.
A beautiful crappy dessert
that has like no flavor.
Yeah.
You know, when you get those bakeries and it's just like they look so fun, and like the cupcakes that are so pretty and then they don't have flavor.
Yeah. There's a place.
Don't you find that enraging?
Yeah, it is. It's too sweet, or it's not nuanced enough. I mean, there are things in here that are really pretty and that you could take a step further and make even prettier if you're that type of person that appreciates those details. I definitely appreciate it when other people do it, but if I'm going to whip something up and put something together, that's not where I'm going to spend my time kind of like preening it. I'd rather get like the seasoning just right. And then the real like icing on the cake is actually cooking it properly, and that's something that I think people don't get. That's like the difference between a good baker and a novice baker, is taking something all the way. So in particular, it's a major fail with pie, because people often don't take pie, especially fruit pie, all the way. So going back to what you said about the berry pie being very expensive, it could be a very expensive failure if you don't take the pie all the way and the fruit doesn't actually boil inside underneath the crust, so that no matter what, if it doesn't come to a boil inside and then you let it cool and you cut it, it's going to just, leak out everywhere. It's going to be like soup. And then you lost, $30 on berries or whatever it is and all that time. And it'll still taste good, but that's where the expense comes into play, because fruit has a lot of juices, and ripe fruit does especially. So if it's seasoned and ripe and perfect and then you don't take it all the way, it might end up being kind of a flop.
And people get I certainly know, I get scared about like cooking it too much, like baking something. You're so afraid of burning something that then you underbake, and there's really nothing more disgusting than an underbaked pie. Like it really is disgusting on so many different levels. So I want to ask you one more question, because I want you to settle something in my mind once and for all. You talked about like making the great crisps, crumbles, buckles, betties, cobblers. What's the difference?
Well, I don't consider buckles to be in the same category, because a buckle is a cake. Crisp, cobblers, crumbles, and betties are all versions of casseroles, and casseroles are great, super approachable. A betty technically uses old bread on top, either cubed up or in breadcrumb form, which is a really old school dessert that should definitely make a comeback, because if you get really good bread from your local bakery and then you don't use it all up and you're like, oh, this bread is hard and crusty, and then you throw it away, you could make it into a pretty awesome dessert if you got used to the idea that you're eating stale bread for dessert. And then a crisp and a crumble are sort of in the same thing, in that they're like a streusely, sandy topping that gets thrown over fruit, and it's fat and flour and sugar, sometimes grains, sometimes nuts. And that is the crisp and crumble category. If you have to break it up and kind of put it over the top, then that is technically you're crumbling it, so that's where that falls. A cobbler can be two different things. In Texas, it's a kind of loose-ish cake batter, but the ratio is different than a buckle. So a buckle is more cake and less fruit. That's why it's its own thing, it's a cake. And a cobbler, like Texas-style cobbler, is more fruit and less cake. And then an American-style cobbler in different other parts of the world, not Texas, can be biscuits or like cut up pieces of raw, like scone dough or cakey dough that gets put on the top and it stays on the surface.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And what's the one? There's one that's also kind of like a cookie.
Oh.
What's that?
I don't know.
All right,
oh, wait, no, maybe it's like a
pandowdy. Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. Give me some. It's a pandowdy.
These are all ancient desserts.
I'm going to be able to sleep
school.
tonight
Yeah.
that it's a pandowdy. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
This is Nicole Rucker. The book is called Dappled. It is a beautiful book, and if you don't love fruit, you're going to learn to love it. Put it in some pie, and then you're going to love it for sure, or even a pandowdy.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Nicole.
Thank you.